They told the public that HAARP was nothing more than a scientific research project, a harmless array of antennas in the frozen wilderness of Alaska. They said it was about studying the ionosphere, about improving communications, and understanding the natural behavior of the Earth's upper atmosphere. That was the official line, the one you could read on government websites and in carefully prepared press releases. But I was inside. I had clearance. I had access, and I saw the documents that were never meant to leave the Pentagon's secure servers. What HAARP truly represents is not science. It is control, a tool so powerful it can bend nature itself, a weapon capable of turning the sky into a battlefield. And the terrifying part? It's already been used, tested, and perfected under the cover of natural disasters the world thinks were accidents of nature. You've noticed it, haven't you? Strange weather patterns, storms that seem to appear out of nowhere, heat waves in regions that never experienced them before, sudden floods that devastate entire towns. The mainstream media always tells you the same thing: climate change, global warming, unpredictable nature. But inside the Pentagon, they had another explanation. They spoke about directed atmospheric manipulation, about geoengineered events. I read after-action reports that cataloged typhoons and hurricanes not as tragedies, but as field results. The shocking part was how clinical it all was. Whole communities destroyed, thousands of lives lost. And for the people behind those doors, it was just data, numbers on a spreadsheet, proof that the weapon was doing what it was designed to do. And no one, not the victims, not the journalists, not even scientists outside the loop, knew the truth. HAARP wasn't built just to control the weather. That was only the surface. What the public never knew is that this array had the ability to influence human consciousness itself. Think about it. If you can alter the electromagnetic balance of the ionosphere, you can interfere with brainwave activity. We are electrical beings, our minds operating on frequencies delta, theta, alpha, beta. The Pentagon understood that if you could broadcast the right signals into the sky, you could send those frequencies right back down into human populations. Control fear, amplify anger, induce confusion. Imagine an entire city gripped by panic with no clear reason, or an enemy force so disoriented they couldn't even follow orders. This was not science fiction. It was in the briefing packets, in classified experiments run not in theory, but in practice. People out there felt moods shift, tensions rise, riots explode, and they never suspected it was being engineered. I remember one particular file, thick, stamped with multiple levels of classification, the kind you had to sign your life away just to glance at. It described something called Project Resonance. According to the report, HAARP had been used to target specific regions during international conflicts. The evidence was chilling. Sudden blackouts of communication in enemy zones, soldiers complaining of hallucinations, whole battalions unable to coordinate because of inexplicable disorientation. These weren't coincidences. These were field tests. The file included logs of when and where HAARP had been activated, and the outcomes were recorded with precision. In one instance, a hostile base went silent for over 48 hours, with survivors later describing unbearable headaches and feelings of dread so intense that some simply abandoned their posts. Officially, these events were blamed on stress, on fatigue, on the fog of war. But I saw the documents. I know what caused it. There are moments when sterile language in reports reveals the ugliest intentions. I remember reading after-action logs that treated entire towns like test sites. The entry would begin with coordinates and timestamps, then move on to a line like, HAARP activation produced intended ionospheric perturbation. Correlated population behavioral variance observed. That's bureaucrat speak for. We flipped a switch, the sky answered, and people behaved differently afterward. In one case study, a Midwestern town experienced a cascade of small incidents, a sudden spike in temper-induced assaults, an unusual number of car crashes at the same intersection over 3 nights, and an inexplicable surge in emergency room admissions for panic attacks. Epidemiologists later chalked it up to seasonal stresses and socioeconomic factors. But hidden in a separate annex was a HAARP activation log dated to the exact same window. They didn't call it an attack. They labeled it an experiment. For those who lived through it, the effects were visceral and real. For those of us reading the files, the lesson was clear. With the right frequency, you could shape human behavior on a mass scale and then wash your hands of responsibility by burying the operational link under layers of secrecy. Technology like this doesn't operate in a moral vacuum. Once a capability exists, the temptation is to use it, not merely to study, but to weaponize. I sat in briefings where military strategists argued about the calculus of deployment, target precision versus collateral psychological impact, short-term disruption versus long-term socio-cultural destabilization. One colonel, whose face I still see in my nightmares, leaned forward and said in a low voice, "If you can broadcast uncertainty into an enemy's rear, you can win without firing a shot." They ran war games based on scenarios where HAARP created storms would cut supply lines or induce mass panic would fracture civil order, and then conventional forces would sweep in to restore stability. In those rooms, ethics were a footnote. The question was efficiency. How many lives were acceptable to sacrifice to gain a strategic advantage? The answer, in that climate of secrecy and fear, was tragically pragmatic. That pragmatic calculus is why countries with such capabilities, or those who think they might obtain them, become less predictable and more dangerous. It's easy to imagine HAARP as a single array in remote Alaska, but the reality of the program is a distributed architecture. The research prototypes, field arrays, and contractor labs were shadowed by layers of obfuscated funding and private front organizations. Satellite uplinks, trans-horizon radios, and HAARP-like emitters in other nations meant that the effect could be globalized and deniable. In one briefing I read, analysts sketched a map of resonance corridors, lines across the planet where ionospheric modulation could be amplified by geography or existing atmospheric phenomena. Those corridors connected to politically sensitive regions. The implication was chilling. With coordination and the right atmospheric conditions, it wasn't only local communities that could be targeted, but entire regions across continents. When I raised the question of oversight, who watches the watchers? The response was evasive. Oversight, they said, would complicate readiness. In practice, that meant covert deployments with plausible deniability. Claim a research posture, run an operational profile, and if the public stumbled across correlations, drown the findings in contradictory reports. Perhaps the darkest part of all is the human experimentation thread woven through the program. I don't mean the sanitized clinical trials you read about in peer-reviewed journals. I mean opaque studies where volunteers were misinformed or where populations were exposed without consent. Internal memos reference targeted cohorts and control populations in ways that make the blood run cold. There are records of classified medical studies that track changes in EEG patterns in communities following targeted broadcasts, and documents that cross-reference those neurologic anomalies with later spikes in psychiatric hospitalization and suicidality. The people behind the screens argued that such data would save lives if used to develop countermeasures or early warning systems. But when the data gatekeepers became the same agencies that could deploy the weapon, the line between defense and offense vanished. I met scientists who quit in disgust, their eyes hollow from the cognitive dissonance of building tools for national security that could be directed inward on innocence. Those resignations were quietly buried. The experiments continued, and the ethical wounds they produced festered in silence. The secrecy wasn't just about shielding the technology from foreign intelligence. It was about controlling the narrative at home. Public perception was managed with surgical precision. Whenever independent researchers or journalists poked too close, entire counter-narratives were deployed. Conspiracy theory became the most effective camouflage. Government-aligned scientists would dismiss concerns by flooding journals with technical papers claiming HAARP was incapable of the alleged effects. Meanwhile, disinformation campaigns infiltrated forums and media outlets, ridiculing dissenters. I saw internal communications describing containment protocols for whistleblowers, legal harassment, reputational takedowns, financial strangulation. Those who pushed hardest were eventually silenced through opaque accidents or sudden personal issues. The irony is that the truth was always hiding in plain sight, buried in redacted documents, cloaked in euphemisms, wrapped in national security rhetoric. When you read enough of these reports, you begin to see the pattern. The louder the denial, the closer someone had gotten to the core of the truth. I once reviewed a classified study that tracked the correlation between atmospheric experiments and global food supply disruptions. On the surface, the document was about ionospheric perturbations and their agricultural impacts. But behind the sterile wording was a clear message. Storms, droughts, and altered rainfall patterns could be engineered, or at least nudged, by deliberate HAARP activity. Imagine a rival nation suddenly crippled by 3 consecutive failed harvests. No bombs, no armies, just hungry citizens and collapsing governments. That was the strategic logic spelled out in cold, bureaucratic language. I remember sitting in the secure reading room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, as the realization sank in. Food was being weaponized. Hunger was no longer an unfortunate byproduct of war. It was being cultivated as a weapon of war itself. When you've seen the graphs overlaying broadcast schedules with rainfall anomalies, the illusion of coincidence dies. What remains is a chilling awareness that climate itself had been turned into a battlefield. The program's architects knew public accountability was their greatest enemy. That's why budgets were hidden inside obscure line items. Electromagnetic research, upper atmosphere studies, ionospheric observation platforms. Billions funneled into projects that no congressional oversight committee could fully trace. The financial camouflage was as sophisticated as the technology itself. Private contractors became the intermediaries, shielding the government from direct responsibility. These companies operated beyond Freedom of Information Act requests, their scientists bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements. I personally met engineers who hinted off the record that their projects had dual-use applications, civilian on paper, but military in practice. The compartmentalization was ruthless. No single team ever saw the whole picture. But if you collected enough fragments, as I did over the years, the mosaic was undeniable. What emerged wasn't science for science's sake. It was infrastructure for covert influence on a planetary scale. One of the most disturbing revelations came not from a document, but from a conversation. An older physicist, a man whose career had spanned Cold War research, told me something in confidence. The ionosphere is the largest antenna on Earth. If you learn to play it, you can reach every mine under it. That sentence still echoes in my head. He explained that while HAARP was officially about studying atmospheric phenomena, its potential to influence human consciousness was the true prize. Small shifts in electromagnetic background noise, imperceptible to the senses, could nonetheless alter neurological rhythms. Sleep cycles, mood stability, decision-making, all could be nudged subtly but effectively. He said it with the weariness of someone who built a monster and realized too late what it could do. When I asked why he was telling me, he only shrugged. Because I won't be alive when they use it in full. But you might be. Over time, I realized that HAARP wasn't a singular project. It was a prototype. The real operations were already migrating to mobile platforms. Ship-mounted arrays, satellite-based systems, and hidden installations scattered across remote parts of the globe. HAARP in Alaska was a lightning rod, the visible tip designed to attract attention, while the real work unfolded elsewhere. I reviewed a map once, heavily redacted, but the dots that weren't blacked out stretched from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. Imagine fleets equipped with technology capable of modifying weather on command, moving with stealth across international waters. Imagine satellites able to direct focused energy into the ionosphere, creating localized disturbances that cascaded into global shifts. That was the future being built while the public argued over a single facility in Gakona. The strategy was simple. Let people obsess over the decoy while the empire perfected its invisible arsenal. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the connections became. Internal memos described coordination between the Pentagon, major telecom corporations, and pharmaceutical companies. At first, the link seemed absurd. What could drug manufacturers have to do with ionospheric heaters? But then came the chilling explanation. Electromagnetic manipulation could destabilize populations, and destabilized populations needed chemical solutions. Antidepressants, sleep aids, anti-anxiety pills. The market expanded in lockstep with experiments in atmospheric frequencies. It was a perfect cycle. Induce the stress, sell the relief. When I confronted a supervisor about this collusion, he gave me the coldest smile I've ever seen. "We don't make people sick," he said. "We just make sure the cure is available when they inevitably are." That sentence taught me everything about the nature of power. It wasn't about defending nations anymore. It was about managing humanity as a resource. By then, paranoia wasn't paranoia anymore. It was survival. I stopped using my personal phone, convinced it was tapped. I noticed the same black SUV parked across from my apartment for 3 nights in a row. My emails began arriving delayed, sometimes never at all. One night, coming home late, I found my apartment door ajar, though nothing appeared stolen. These weren't coincidences. They were warnings, a reminder that the walls were closing in. I considered disappearing, vanishing into anonymity, but the truth already burned inside me too hot to smother. Once you know what's been done in the shadows, silence feels like complicity. Still, I understood the cost. Whistleblowers don't retire quietly. They vanish, or they're discredited beyond recognition. Each day felt like a coin toss. Would I wake up free, or would my name appear in the news under the phrase apparent suicide? The final straw was a briefing I wasn't supposed to see. A classified simulation projected global climate events over the next 2 decades. Events not as possibilities, but as scheduled outcomes. Entire regions highlighted in red, their agricultural systems collapsing under engineered drought. Other areas predicted to drown beneath endless manufactured storms. It wasn't a forecast. It was a playbook. That night, I understood why secrecy was absolute. The world wasn't drifting toward disaster. It was being steered into it. The agenda was no longer national defense. It was global control through engineered crisis. Weather as leverage, fear as currency, survival as obedience. That's when I decided to speak out. I knew the risks, but I also knew the silence was more dangerous. Because if they succeed, the world won't even realize it's living under an artificial sky, a climate scripted not by nature, but by men who learned how to play God. When I finally left active duty, I thought distance would dull the memory. It didn't. Instead, the truth kept pressing against me like the weight of an unfiled case, impossible to ignore. I began cross-referencing dates of HAARP activations with news archives, humanitarian reports, and the quiet obituaries that never made the front pages. Patterns emerged so stark they felt obscene. Spikes in emergency admissions, unusual social unrest, and localized crop failures, all lining up with previously classified ionospheric tests. I can hear the bureaucrats now, arming themselves with euphemisms: research anomaly, experimental artifact, statistical noise. But numbers don't cry in hospital wards. They don't bury children or watch livelihoods evaporate. People do. And as I sat with the families of those whose towns have been listed as case studies, I realized the moral calculus I'd read in secure briefings had people's faces attached to it. That realization changed me. It turned abstract policy into a human ledger, and it made silence intolerable. So what can be done? There are no simple answers, but there are necessary first steps. Transparency is the obvious one. Declassify the operational logs, put audits under independent international oversight, and allow scientists with no security ties to replicate and verify claims in the open. Second, build legal strictures. Treaties that categorically ban weaponizing the atmosphere, with enforcement mechanisms that are more than political statements. Third, protect whistleblowers. Real protections, not token gestures, so people inside programs can come forward without watching their lives be dismantled. I know how naive that sounds in a world that hoards secrets like currency. I also know how necessary it is. Power concentrated without accountability is power that can and will be abused. If the tools exist to shape the climate, the mind, or society, then those tools must be governed by the public, because the public will always pay the price of secrecy. I risk everything by telling you this. I risk my reputation, my safety, and the quiet life I thought I might finally earn. But I made a promise. To the men and women who were harmed, to the communities whose pain was cataloged and forgotten, that someone outside those secure rooms would carry the story into the light. This is not a call to hysteria. It is a call to vigilance. Demand transparency. Ask hard questions. Support those who come forward with evidence, not ridicule. And watch the skies with both curiosity and skepticism, because the most dangerous manipulation is the one you never realize is happening to you. They taught me secrecy to protect operations. I learned secrecy protects power. It's time to change which we protect.